Okay, well, welcome everybody. And many of us have been here just talking all sorts of things on this lovely Earth Day. It's a sort of beautiful day, but it's a good day to talk about the natural foliage we have around here, and in particular, what we can do with it. This is going to be a very interesting talk today. And without much further ado, let me put Tony on it. And just one last thing. In terms of questions, what I'd recommend, he's going to be pausing periodically to ask for questions. So save your questions until then, and then you can ask them in person. Let me give it to Tony. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, hello, everybody. My little ditty today is kind of interesting and sort of all over the map, what you would sort of expect, I think. So I'm going to go right over to my PowerPoint presentation. So my little presentation is on tree identification and tree parts for art. We're not going to go through a lot of trees, just a few, but it's more information about what we can get and what parts we can get from trees. And we shall progress with that. Identifying trees for sources of working material. Basically, the objective is to enable accurate tree identification for useful raw material to work with. So we're going to deal with a few species, and then we're going to look at parts of those trees and sort of identify what can be done. The first thing I wanted to show or talk about was the difference between gymnosperms, which are cone-bearing trees, mostly, and angiosperms, which are flowering trees with fleshy or dry fruits. Now, gymnosperms are mostly conifers with a few outliers. Most of you know the ginkgo biloba, and that's considered a gymnosperm, though it doesn't look much like one. But its little fruit, actually, if you take it apart, it has the parts of a cone, as is the case with podocarpus, and some of you may know cycads, the sago palm, which is not a palm, but it's a gymnosperm, and also related to pine trees and fir trees and the like. All gymnosperms produce cones, although sometimes they might not look like cones. Angiosperms, which is the flowering plants, have flowers, some with both male and female parts. Others have separate male and female flowers. All angiosperms produce fruits, although the fruits may be cone-like, as in birches and alders. Now that we are confused, let's look at a highly desirable gymnosperm. Now, I'm just wondering if anybody recognizes what this tree is. Not a clue. That's not good, because every part of this tree is poisonous. And this is the taxus, or the yews. In particular, this is the English yew we're looking at. And if you go to Europe, it's called the English yew. In England, it's called the Irish yew in Ireland. And on the mainland, it's called the European yew, all the same thing. And all of the yews have this distinctive red kind of berry-like fruit, which is not a fruit and not a berry, but a cone, even though it doesn't much look like one. And normally the easiest way to identify a yew is not only looking for these red like berries, but also the type of foliage is flattened and with a nice green color to it, and typically used as a small sort of tree that grows next to houses and also hedges. It can be sheared, pruned like this, as you see. Now, this particular piece that we're looking at here, I've sort of enlarged because it demonstrates something that I find really quite interesting, and that's called adaptive wood. And just wanted you guys to sort of look at this and see if you can identify how many piths we're looking at in this little cross section, and what's the difference between this side and this side of the main pith. And if you look closely, you can sort of see that there's sort of two concentric circles here. So we have two piths here, which is typical of yews, because they start off as a lot of stems that grow together. You have kind of a branch going off here, another pith possibly here that was very small. And over here is another pith. So we have about 3 or 4 piths, and there's probably another one to the further to the left as well. But the interesting part about this is the adaptive wood. Usually what we have is you get some kind of force like a wind on a tree stem, and that tree will produce wood, what's called adaptive wood, to one side or the other side to keep the tree standing up relatively vertical. And that's what we have here on this side. You see a lot of distances between the growth rings, and over here you see a much shorter distance. So this is the adaptive wood that the tree puts on to stabilize itself in the wind. So this is the stuff I kind of just talking about, but all U parts are poisonous and should be worked carefully with. The immediate kind of cleanup on it. On a brighter note, Taxol, which is U oil, is a major cancer fighting tool. Look at the crosscut. We talked about the different piths. And we're talking now about reaction or adaptive wood. A constant directional wind will cause adaptive wood to form in order to support the verticality of the tree. So if we look at this compression versus tension in trees, it's a well-known fact that the conifers, all of the gymnosperms, work with compression wood. And that means that on the side that is, if you're forcing down, this is considered compression on the top part, and tension is considered on the lower part. Angiosperms are just the exact opposite. They will form wood on the tension side, and conifers will do on the compression side. And so if you look at this little picture here, you can see that this tree, let's see. So this tree here is a hardwood or an angiosperm. And because the wind is going in from left to right and pushing against that tree, this is considered the tension side. In particular, down here is where the tree will put adaptive wood on if it's a flowering tree or like a hardwood or an angiosperm. But over here where the gymnosperms are, just the opposite happens. And so what you have are roots that are not just roots, but also adaptive wood that is meant to hold the tree up on this side or on the compression side. And the reason that that's important, if you think about it, is that oftentimes when we look at trees and we want to know if it's going to fall over on our house, if it's a angiosperm, you want to look on the tension side of it to the left here to make sure that those roots are protected. Not so important on this side for holding the tree up. Just the opposite for conifers and for gymnosperms. On the compression side is the important part to the right here, not so important on the left-hand side. And that's an important thing when we look at trees as far as them being safe goes. So that little thing about tension and compression, any questions on that? So, okay, no questions, then we'll go to the next slide. Where are the largest roots on the hardwood or the angiosperm and the gymnosperm or the conifer? So the hardwood trees form the largest roots to the left of that little thing that we just showed here. And the conifers do it to the right side. Now, branches are subject to the same physical laws. The branches are complicated due to the attachment at the stem and the various forces with the aspect of the branch. Because a branch can go way out to and then turn up or turn down, and it's quite difficult with branches to determine where the tension and the compression side is. Usually, if it's where it's connected to the stem, the compression side is going to be at the bottom, but that's not always the case depending on how the branch grows. And you'll find that cutting branches is always a trickier thing than cutting the main stem as far as getting your saw caught into it. And the other thing about when we talk about adaptive wood is that if we think about this, when we're thinking about making a bowl or getting wood out of this, when you have all of this adaptive wood here, this part will dry differently and shrink differently from this part. So what I normally do, when some of you may have some experience with this, when you have this situation, is I usually make a cut straight down through the pith like this, make a bowl out of this side, which is compressed, and make a bowl out of this side, which is enlarged, and have better luck than if I tried doing, say a bowl, or say cutting through this way, trying a bowl this way, and trying a bowl this way, because you're going to have too many conflicting differences in all of the tangential and radial kind of shrinkage. That's just sort of a something that I've utilized when I work with bowls, and it seems to work fairly well as far as the drying and the shrinkage goes. Any comment on that? Now, I wanted to mention that stands have very little adaptive wood, which is why in the forest, when you have these tight growths of pine and fir and things like that, they make excellent lumber because they don't have the lower branches, which give you knots, and they tend to be fairly straight up and down. There's not a lot of wind pushing them, and they make for the best lumber and timber. Now, but the problem, of course, is that if you grow a gymnosperm in the open, you'll have just the opposite effect. You have a lot of branches and a lot of problems with that, and it does not make very good wood for that reason. The same can be said of gymnosperms. This lack of adaptive wood is why IKEA is so wealthy, because in Sweden it's covered with birches. The birches growing very close to each other, so the wood is very, very uniform and very nice, pleasant lumber. Not spectacular form or grain or any kind of interest to it, but it's just straight. In Australia, the eucalypts, all of the eucalyptus are tall and narrow. Here in California, eucalypts are huge and widespreading, lots of adaptive wood and lots of problems because they're grown out in the open. Now, wanted to take a look at the different parts of a tree and talk to you a little bit about what's sort of useful and what happens with it and things like that. I particularly like this particular drawing because it drives home one point that I think is important. There's no such thing as a round tree, and there's no such thing as a pith being in the center, because that's sort of talk about absolutes. It's always a little off center, sometimes quite a bit off center. And the rings that go around are not really rings. They're more spheres, and they go in and out, and there's defects and things like that. When we look at a stem like this and we have the different parts, you look at the different things that are going on in their bark on the outside, and then you have the cambium, the vascular cambium, and then on the inside of the vascular cambium, the first thing you come to is the wood, which in this case would be the sapwood, and then eventually towards the center, more of the heartwood. And when we're looking at wood, we're just talking about sapwood and heartwood. And sapwood on just inside the vascular cambium is active and alive with water flowing through it. And then as it gets a little bit older, after 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the species, that sapwood stops with the water transportation and basically gets plugged up with tylosis and lignin and things like that, so that it starts the process of turning into heartwood. And all of this means is that the best wood is the heartwood because it's the most consistent. It has the most decay fighting materials in it, like lignin and sap. And this is true of most species, not all, but we really like to work with heartwood. Dale Nish, in one of his books, made the statement, in particular when talking about fruitwood. His opinion of fruitwood was that it was terrible unless you only worked with the heartwood. Don't try working with the sapwood. And that's because sapwood has a lot more activity going on with it, a lot more water in it, and when it dries, it tends to warp and crack and change a lot more than the heartwood. And so this distinction between heartwood and sapwood is a fairly important one. And so I'm always amused a little bit that when we talk about live edge trees or live edge slabs and things, that we're not only including wood, but we're also including things like phloem and the cortex, also the cork cambium, as well as the vascular cambium, and the inner bark and the outer bark, even the epiderm. All of these things are not wood that we're talking about until we get into the sapwood and the heartwood. And so you're, in a sense, when you have a slab that has got, or you do any kind of live edge, say you do a natural edge bowl, you have to do extra special things for the bark itself, because it's hard to hold the bark on without crazy glue or some way of keeping it there. And if you think about it, well, first of all, the vascular cambium is only a cell wide, so you can't see it. But it's what is doing all of the secondary meristematic activity. It pushes cells inside it'll divide and put a xylem or a wood cell to the inside, and the very next thing it does is divide and put a cell of phloem to the outside. And that activity constantly going on is just toggled back and forth, uniform throughout the entire tree. So in one split second, it makes one cell of xylem, and in the second one, it makes one cell of phloem. What we're talking about going to the outside of the trees, outside of the vascular cambium, is not wood, it's not xylem. It's phloem, it's cortex, cork cambium, and of course the bark and stuff like that. And all of that material is really more, it doesn't have a lot of lasting quality to it unless you take an extra effort in order to preserve the things like the wood and the cortex and things like that. So it's not really an entirely a wood piece. There's other things in it. Down here is kind of interesting. So here in this little drawing, there's one ring has a scar from a forest fire. That's a little bit oversimplified, but it's possible to read on a ring when there was a forest fire. It's also possible to read where it's really drought, they have very little water because there's very little space between the rings. And if there's really large spaces, say, well, this was a really good year here because the early wood is large, and then it gets onto the late wood, and that is indicative of a year where they must have had a lot of moisture and the weather was good. So it's one way of tracking what happens from year to year, and sometimes these are actually used in criminal cases to prove certain points. But that just to an aside. Let's see. The structure of a tree trunk. This is an enlargement of one of the things that we just looked at. Because there are other things that are here, and I'm sure you've heard these terms in passing, but rays are something that's a little bit different than the sapwood and the heartwood and things like that. Rays are, they cut radial across the xylem and even go in past the vascular cambium to the phloem. They help put material like nutrients and water, as well as photosynthates into the middle and also all the way through the tree. So they're very, very important. And as you know, with wood, some wood like oak, for instance, the rays are very visible because they're put in a series of a number of rays, and you can see them. And other woods like pear and things like that, for instance, you can't see the rays, but they're always there. And so they're sort of an important thing to do. Now, I told you before, vascular cambium takes one cell out to the phloem, and then the next moment takes a cell to the inside to the wood, and then outside to the phloem. Every once in a while, that vascular cambium will also formulate the rays. And I'm not sure quite how that happens, but it requires a bit more botanical information. But it's interesting that the vascular cambium does three things. It produces wood, it produces phloem, and it produces rays as well. Also, when you look in here, you've got the pith, and the pith is the weakest part of the wood because it's a very, at the very beginning of the plant when it was growing, that's where the pith starts. And even the wood around it is considered juvenile and very weak, which is why when you cut a tree, you'll sometimes see almost immediate cracking from the pith going out a ways because of the juvenile wood that surrounds it. That wood is not differentiated very well, and so it's really a weak point of the tree. After that, though, of course, you've got the heartwood around the pith, which is good wood to work with. And then you start getting into the sapwood and eventually all the way out close to the vascular cambium where you have the active sapwood. And that stuff is a lot more water content and also causes, with the differentiation of drying, a lot of cracking and problems as well. So those are your rays, your early wood and late wood, and your growth rings that you know about already. And then, of course, the bark has the inner bark. Some trees have 3 or 4 layers of bark, and it has a secondary phloem in here on the inner bark. That's caused, again, the vascular cambium makes that. But the cork cambium, which is out here, is responsible for pushing out bark. Not all species have cork cambium all the time. Sometimes it just shows up when it's necessary to start building bark. Then it's really not there. So cork cambium is a very interesting topic. But be that as it may, that's your standard structure of a tree trunk. Any questions?
Tony, talk about why things like sycamore, whose bark does not appear to even be on the tree many times, how does it differ from, let's say, a redwood, which has a very distinctive image, much like what's in this picture?
Yeah, and I mean, the differences in bark is very important for a lot of things, and especially when we talk about fires, because redwoods are adapted very much to fires and their bark is really thick and there's lots of layers to it and there's lots of air in there as well. So it really responds well to fire. But a lot of trees are very thin barked. Douglas fir is not particularly thick bark, and they have problems with fires. Now you get your sycamores and your other trees that what happens with them is that as the bark ages, it becomes patchy and it sort of flakes off. And oftentimes those trees are very thin barked as well. So they're constantly producing new bark underneath the old bark. And that difference in color gives you kind of an interesting pattern. You see that in Chinese elm, in Zelkova. You certainly see it with the London plane tree, with the sycamores. That kind of bark is one that's sort of constantly dropping and peeling off and stuff like that. Eucalyptus, some of the eucalyptus, like the globulus, which is the blue gum, has a whole lot of strips of bark falling off all the time. And it's just a constant shedding process. And it tends to also enrich the soil below them because there's a lot of piles of this detritus, so to speak. But anything else?
Yeah. So when you have a cork oak and they strip the bark to make cork, how far are they actually stripping down? Meaning, are they pulling off the secondary phloem as well as the cork cambium, or what?
No, they cut exactly to the next layer of the inner bark. Okay, so basically they take off that cork and what's left is a very light brownish sort of bark as well. They can't cut much further into it without causing problems with the vascular cambium because the phloem, as it is produced, almost instantly it only works for a little while being like a year, and it gets sort of crushed between the bark and the vascular cambium, and it disappears, or it's assimilated into cells, or it gets sloughed off. And so it's kind of part of the waste of it. So that's with the Quercus subeer, which is the cork oak. You can do that for years and years as long as the climate is amenable and the tree doesn't require that extra protection that the outer layer gives it. And so when they cut it, then they have to wait. It's several years before they can cut that particular tree again. And they just take squares off of it as well. It's an interesting process. I've been to Italy and Portugal and stuff and seen how they do it. And it's a fascinating process. And some of those places like the island in Italy where it's done so much is that they make everything out of cork. You can have postcards made out of cork, paper made out of cork and stuff like that. They just love cork because there's so much of it.
I've watched some videos of them stripping beech trees, the bark, and it looks like they take the whole bark off of it. Does it kill the tree?
No. If they take the whole bark off, there's still a little bit of protection before you get into the phloem and the vascular cambium. But if you're taking all of the bark off, you're taking off all of the protection that the bark provides for the tree. So you better hope that something doesn't come around that's going to attack the tree, and without the bark, it has no protection. Bark also insulates, and so if it's a cold temperature problem, your cold temperatures might kill the tree, which otherwise it wouldn't have if the bark was still on.
Do they, getting back to the cork oak, do they plant like groves of it strictly for harvesting, or is it just wild and they harvest it that way?
It's just wild, and they're if you think of oak trees in groves, they tend to grow in a microclimate which provides that for them. So you have a whole lot of those trees, but they're spread quite a bit apart.
How old does a tree? How old is it get before they can first start harvesting some of the oak?
With a cork oak, probably about 30 years. I'm guessing a little bit on that because the trees that I've seen in Europe are really old. They tend to be 200, 300 years old, and they've been cutting cork off of them for a century. So they're sort of an amazing tree for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes?
Real quickly into a different species. In the East, they tap maple trees to get the sap to make syrup.
Right.
How far do the taps go into the tree?
That's an interesting question because they can't go too far or they won't have any sap coming from it. And what they're looking at, what the sap that they get is not what you typically think of that comes from, it's the initial burst in the springtime where water first starts and nutrients first start coming up the tree in the sapwood. So they have to tap just beyond the vascular cambium, and then that's where the sap comes and they take it out from there. It's very precise. If they go even a little bit further, they're going to damage the tree and they're not going to have any sap in the way. Fascinating thing.
Is there a better time to cut the tree if you want to have like a natural edge bowl where the bark will stay on?
Yes, and that would be in the fall. When the tree is starting to slow down, it doesn't have a whole lot of movement as far as sap is concerned, even late in the fall, even into the winter, because then you don't have the kind of flowing sap that you would have in the springtime. In the springtime, it's very difficult to hang on to bark on wood because it wants to slip right off. All right, let's take a look at some things that for objects of art, so to speak, that we can get from trees. So in the previous slide, there are many named parts found in a crosscut cookie, and we just talked about all that. And you can ask yourself, what if those parts can be used for art projects? When we're talking about wood bowls, we also talk about a lot of other things like Christmas ornaments and stuff like that. Bob Nolan has taught classes at a couple I've attended where it was palm seeds and a few other things that you can make into nice little projects. And it's a good use of the tree when you can do that. So you ask yourself, what parts can be used for art? Well, the pith, I highly doubt that the pith can be used. Yeah, I do have a project which involves the pith, because if you leave the pith on plum trees, it'll cause a crack that opens up and makes it look like a pizza where somebody's taken one piece out. And then I thought about cutting those slim or thin cookies and putting that into a frame, and you'd have a whole bunch of pizza pie, so to speak. But I've never done that. I've only imagined it. So at any rate, so the juvenile wood we can't do much with. The heartwood, of course, is used quite a bit, and the live and dead sapwood is used. Can't use the cambium, it's only a cell wide. The xylem tends to fall apart. I will talk a little bit about xylem right at the end. I'm sorry, not xylem, but phloem. And then cortex and cork cambium, those are part of your natural edged pieces too, the inner bark. So in here we have pictures of a couple of things. This is a camphor slab, and this one here is a redwood slab, which has a lot, it almost looks like it's a burl. The one is a conference table. If you're interested, it only costs $32,000 and is a nice piece. Now you can utilize other parts of the tree for different projects. I don't know how many of you have tried working with pine cones or different types of cones. If you get them at different stages or different ages on the tree, they can be carved. If you have an open thing, this is a pinyon pine here, incidentally. If you have an open cone or one that just starts to open, you can use some epoxy to fill it in so that it stays together and then turn it. And you can get interesting things from different types of cones. Of course, these are all going to come from gymnosperms. Seeds, I'll talk about in a bit. And of course, the fruits, leaves once in a while can be used for things, but it has to be an unusual leaf. Acer macrophyllum, which is the big leaf maple. In Canada, we used to use them for plates, for dinner plates, because they're quite large and they make a nice sort of aspect for serving something. Needles, flowers, thorns, spikes, these are all possibilities. Of course, burls, we'll talk about in just a sec. Galls, oak galls, when they're green still, you might be able to work with. But you just have to sort of be adventurous and see what happens. This is one that I wanted to show, and this is the largest of all the cones and the pine cones. This is from a sugar pine. And to the right here are Christmas ornaments. These are the treetop ornaments that were made for that, specifically for that reason. But you can see the unusual kind of aspect that you get if you get them at the right age point. And of course, sugar pines is the easiest way to identify a sugar pine is look around for the cones, and the cones can be like 1 foot to 2 feet long. So that's an easy way to identify it. And this is a picture of the Pinus labertiana, which is the sugar pine. We find them usually about 3,500 feet in elevation, which is why we don't see them around here. Though you can grow them pretty much anywhere, but it likes to be up in the altitude. Also, the Banksia. Banksia is a genus of Australian plants, and they're mostly shrubs, sometimes small trees. But Banksias produce a dry fruit after the flower that looks exactly like wood. You can turn these things any way you want to, and they come out quite nicely. But and you don't have to go to Australia to find Banksia fruits. Most of your gardens, your botanical gardens, have examples of it. I know the one in Santa Cruz and also the one in Tilden Park. You can collect these things because after they'll fall off the tree, and you can just pick them up, and then you can do what you want with them. And they really make nice little sculptures when you turn them on a lathe. Anybody work with Banksia stuff at all?
They
It's very
have.
difficult.
He used to worry about the flying seeds.
Yeah, I think some of the fruits are better for that than others, because some of the ones that where the seeds come out a little bit might be a bit of a problem, but other ones, the seeds kind of embedded in there.
Tony, there's a wives' tale out there that says the seeds only leave if there's a forest fire. Is that correct?
Yes. It's another adaptation to fire, and there's a lot of trees have a lot of adaptations. You probably know this, but the manzanita, or I'm sorry, the the manzanitas in a lot of up in the Sierra foothills, they require a fire to go to burn them before the seeds will even start growing. They're not they won't grow, or they won't prop out at all until after they've gone through a fire. So this is one seed that I'd like to try. This is Coco de Mer palm seed, and it's endemic to the islands of Graceland and Curiosity in the Seychelles. And so if you want to travel over there, maybe you can find one of these and bring them home. Coco de Mer, that means, you know, the sea coconut, so to speak, is the largest seed in the world. Now, we talk about burls. Burls are a fascinating topic because nobody really quite understands why a tree produces burls. There's all sorts of theories that comes from an insect bite, or it's an abnormality of some sort that the tree for some reason just kind of goes crazy. But Kevin Smith, who's a sort of a famous arborist, writes quite a bit, and his opinion is that it's a greatly abnormal proliferation of xylem production by the vascular cambium. And that production is basically all all sort of points, growth points, apical points of growth. So buds basically that haven't opened up. And just by the thousands, a burl will just keep producing these buds, and it causes a bulge in the tree, usually in the first 8 feet of the trunk. And that bulge is referred to as a burl. Don't be confused by other things, like if a lawnmower damages a tree when it's young, sometimes that side will flatten out or it will swell out, but that's not a burl. But a burl is really this kind of growth of some sort that the tree goes through for some reason. And we've never been able to figure out how to induce it to make trees grow burls. But some species are more like to do it than others. They say that all species will, but oftentimes they have to be really, really old before they start producing burls. If you think of redwood burls, and I've never seen a redwood burl around here on redwoods. Well, maybe I take that back. There have been a few small ones, but the really big ones are up where the giant redwoods are up in Humboldt County and other places where the redwoods are really old and really large, and they'll grow some burls. Same with the Pacific madrone, which is a common California native, but you have to go up in the woods somewhere where it gets really, really large before you start finding burls. And you just don't see them on the younger trees. But burls are fascinating. This is a black oak on the left, and it's almost like the chicken and the egg, but this burl over time just this burl here fell out, and it's quite the nice piece. This is a camphor burl. Camphor is one of those trees that produces burls quite a bit. And, again, older trees, but camphor is a really nice source of burl wood.
Will you damage the tree if you cut the burl off?
You certainly will.
Okay.
And we refer to that as poaching.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But it's a good question, because we just talked about taking the bark off of the Quercus suber, which in the most part doesn't damage the tree, but taking a burl off does, because it's connected to the xylem that's inside the tree, and you're just opening up a whole window of decay into the stem of the tree by taking it off.
I got a question for you on the camphor wood. I really like it. I like the smell of it. is it used in making medicine?
Well, it's used in quite a bit of ways. If you remember the Bengay, which was
Yeah,
you rub on sore muscles,
yeah.
camphor was the main ingredient in Bengay because it is a muscle relaxant and soothes the muscle with the coolness that it provides. For those of you who are drug addicts, ecstasy, people that take that, the main oil in ecstasy is camphor. There are actually a couple of other trees that they use the oil for too, but camphor is one of the main ones that's the oil for ecstasy. But as far as other kind of medicinal purposes, I think it's just the usage that's used in analgesics where you have muscle relaxant and things like that. We used to remind people that burn firewood, that it's not a good idea to burn camphor inside your house because it's going to proliferate. It's the smell and the odor, but also the actual smoke material throughout the house, and it can be damaging to your breathing for that reason. So that's a caution on it. Any other questions?
Yes. So, like, if you trim an apple tree, a lot of times, right where you trimmed it, there will be an area that forms eyes that don't sprout until something else happens. But there's a bunch of eyes there, and you can tell because it's kind of spiky. Would you consider that a burl?
No, because when you cut a branch off of an apple tree, then what happens is underneath the bark, there are all these adventitious buds. Latent buds is another term for them. And so cutting the branch invigorates them to swell. All right, now they may swell, but they may not pop out with new branches. Usually they do. I mean, usually when you cut a branch of most trees, and apple included, some of those buds will pop out with little stems. And it's a way of recovering some leaf for the tree that the reason that that's done. And some of the other buds, if they don't, will stay dormant like that. But it's not the same as a burl because a burl is really a proliferation of a whole bunch of buds, enough to cause a swelling coming out of it. Now, some trees will readily produce small burls. I'm sure you've seen lots of tiny burls on plum trees, for instance, or on American elm, for instance, as well. A lot of small little ones that form on the outside of the bark almost. And they tend to be not pretty hard to work with because they're not that solid. And a lot of them are just formed from the sapwood. But the trees that have good burls are the ones that are really, really old, and they have a tendency to produce burls. So it's a fascinating topic, one of my favorites. Any other questions?
The base of California pepperwoods often have sprouting things, kind of like redwoods do. Are those burls?
Yes. You'll see on California peppers, they have a tendency to produce burls. And so those burls are all these buds that have not grown out. But right on the edge of on the burls with California pepper, they will pop out with stems. And redwoods, you get all of this suckering from the base of redwoods. That doesn't become a burl until the tree gets a whole lot older and it starts to, instead of propagating all of these suckers, it starts growing as a burl. There's a little bit of a difference between suckers and burls. But burls are just not opened up buds, and suckers, of course, are opened up buds. And a lot of trees have a bad habit of producing suckers, but we still don't know that suckers may have a benefit to a tree of one sort or another. All right, now I see you guys are getting warmed up now and you're asking more questions. That's good. I appreciate the question. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about the graft line. So grafts, on the other hand, are wood. Yeah, they're basically all xylem. And if you go to the outside where the phloem and the included bark is, then you have that as well. But below is a walnut grafted tree and the bowl crafted from it. John Cobb did the turning on this particular bowl. I did the fun stuff, which is the chainsaw work. So on the tree on the left, that's the walnut tree. And it's got a top of English walnut, and at the bottom it's got a black walnut base. But that there is the graft line. And so as most wood turners, I would think you get fairly excited if you saw something like this, because right through, all the way through that graft line is a line. And if you turn your bowl sort of on the side, you can imagine that you can get a bowl with a nice sort of evident graft line, which you see here. And this effect is really quite spectacular. And if the graft is holding and there's no problems with it, this is quite, this might as well be just one piece of wood, because the graft is basically grown into that point. But it's different DNA and different things. And so this is much different looking, of course, than this. But they're just, one is the rootstock and the other one is the scion, or the top stalk. And we're always looking for grafts and graft lines for that reason. This one's kind of unusual in the sense that the graft line is usually lower. We sometimes refer to this as top grafting, where the graft is a little bit higher. And this next little tree that we have, you've probably seen in bloom over the last couple of weeks, is this is a Japanese flowering cherry called Kwansan, Prunus seriolata Kwansan, and double pinks. They're bred for the double pinks because they make a great display of wonderful bloom. But these are all top grafted. So if we look at these trees, we know that the graft is down here somewhere. And they tend to get a bottle effect because the rootstock is stronger growing than the scion and the top stalk. So there's a really good picture of this. This is a slab taken sliced right through the graft line. And if you look at this, here's the rootstock. And with the sapwood and the heartwood here, and then of course the bark out here. And then at this point is the graft. But over time, because the rootstock is more vigorous growing and grows faster, what happens is you get a shrinkage at this top, and the top piece, the scion here, is less thrifty and grows smaller, and you get this kind of shrinking effect. And it's sort of a spectacular thing in some ways, but the problem with it is that over time, this tree will die, and what will die will be the top part, but the bottom, the rootstock, will still be alive, simply because it kind of chokes itself out that way because of the different growths or rated growths per top and bottom as far as the graft is concerned. But again, if you take a look at this, you see the line going straight across, line straight across here. See how healthy all of this wood and how uniform it is. And then you start getting into where things are compressed and not growing as well. And you can see the deterioration as it goes here, even out to here, where this tree was starting to die back. But interesting look there is, and that makes a nice art piece to go to take a slab or a slice through the tree at that point. And if you drive down a lot of streets around here, you'll see this particular tree, and you'll see the bottle effect. And in a lot of cases, you'll see them half dead. And it's sort of an interesting phenomenon, but it's one that you can take advantage of when people want to remove their dead cherry tree.
Tony, can the tree be regrafted?
Could you regraft it? Absolutely, yes.
The top part can be cut off, the part that's dying, and
yeah, you could cut off just a little bit below the top, right? And then you could slice in, and you can put bud grafts or twig grafts in the fall, where you slice them and put them in right to where the cambium is, and do lots of them because only some of them will take, and then they can grow from there. So yeah, you can do that.
Would the rootstock be cherry wood too?
Nope. It is cherry, but it normally is choke cherry, right? Don't know
Okay.
if you are familiar with chokecherry, but in British Columbia, where I was raised, so to speak, we had chokecherries everywhere because the birds would plant them and they grow wild. But the chokecherry is a very, very strong growing tree, and it's related to the flowering cherry and the fruiting cherry, but not exactly close to it. And I suspect now, I haven't really verified this, but I expect now that they may use other rootstocks and not use
Yeah.
chokecherry, but I'm pretty sure this is chokecherry.
Yeah, because my sister's got a tree that's got about 4 or 5 different fruits on it.
And what's the rootstock?
I don't know. She bought it at the nursery that way. It came that way, and it's got peaches and plums and stuff like that on it.
Yeah, those are kind of one-stop shopping type trees,
Yeah.
which is interesting, but usually there's some things that will grow on the same rootstock and be slightly different fruits, like your plums and your peaches and your nectarines.
Yeah.
Apricots, you can do those together. Sometimes it's harder to mix in the apples with them. Apple trees, oftentimes you'll see examples where you have 5 different apple varieties.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do apple and pear on the same, but it's always a tricky business because you're crossing over a lot of genetic history there, and sometimes that is not always going to take. But I'm sure that there's the people who do the grafting and stuff have a good time putting together these trees. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to just mention, because to me it's sort of a fascinating topic, is that when a trunk starts growing, where it comes down into the ground, there's a taper which kind of comes out. And in some trees, like the carob, for instance, it's really way wavy in and out. So if you cut a cookie, it looks like a starfish or something. But that trunk taper eventually, when it hits the soil, turns into the root system. And that transition zone between trunk and root is a great opportunity for all sorts of different figures and forms, because roots are different than the trunk of a tree. And they're different by quite a bit. Because when you think about it, let's see what I've said in my English here. As a trunk taper heads into the soil, a tree transitions into the root crown. Eventually, the entire root system is reached. Roots are different from stems. The apical meristems push the outward growth of root hairs. There are no leaves, no leaf axils, no flower buds, no buds. Eventually, roots enlarge and produce a thin bark with phloem, bark, and vascular cambium, sapwood, and heartwood. But that's later, after the root has sort of pushed its way out and root hairs and stuff like that. So depending on species, rootwood can be a different color and texture from above ground wood. Roots store carbohydrate, and the wood is often smooth and creamy, with it's very hard to distinguish the growth rate. And the possibilities in this are endless, but one word of caution: the roots are not friendly to chainsaws. Better to use compressed air or water, simply because when you're working in the dirt, and also roots tend to encapsulate rock and things like that, and cutting through a rock with a chainsaw is never a fun thing. But oftentimes people will use an air spade or a water pressure to wash off all of the root and do it that way. And you can get some interesting things with that transition zone between trunk and root. So here's a couple. The one on the left is actually a 300-year-old Chinese sculpture, but it is a root and is kind of clever as to how they did that. I would not venture to try this myself, but you can see that roots have a lot of possibilities as to what you can do. Now, the other thing that you see on the right here is interesting, because a lot of root sculptures is upside down, right? So this is the tree trunk, and as it goes in and transitions to the root system, it changes, and the root architecture is of course quite variable, and oftentimes you use that to support the whole piece. But I really quite like the looks of that. And this is nothing that I guess you can do with a lathe and turn and stuff like that. But roots are sort of interesting and should be explored. There's certainly, like I said, a difference between roots and the top. And even the transition between those two is, of course, very interesting and an interesting study in itself. Any of you had any things to do with roots?
I was thinking about root burls.
Yeah, that's interesting because the burl, I would think, would start at the trunk originally and work its way into the root system. But root burls themselves, what trees have you seen that in?
The redwoods, I'm thinking of when Bill Tarleton used to dig up the root burls for the redwoods, which he would share sometimes.
That's interesting. There are some trees that have lignotubers, which are underground root structures. So they survive fires because the lignotubers will pop out with new growth after the fire's finished. And those lignotubers can be quite large, and they would be interesting in their own right too.
I took out a camphor tree in the backyard. It wasn't that old. It was only about the main stump was only about 8 inches in diameter. But the further I got down to the ground, the darker it got, the more beautiful the wood got. And we even dug down a couple of feet into the ground. There was no burrows on it, but the wood was just beautiful. The further I got down to the ground.
Yeah, and I think that happens sometimes. When I worked in Albany, we had hundreds of camphor trees as street trees, and the burled trees were often quite small. And it seemed like the burl sapped some of their energy, and they really didn't grow that big. And I think that that's true. So though even though it was a small looking tree, it might be a little older than it looks, just simply because the burl may have slowed it down, especially if especially if the roots themselves are enlarging for one reason or another. So phloem, which is not wood, and the vascular cambium, remember, goes to the inside with xylem and goes to the outside with phloem. And phloem is usually crushed between the bark and the vascular cambium, or it's dissolved and gets reassimilated into the cells. There are one species, one of my least favorite genus of trees is the populus, collectively called cottonwoods or poplars. However, some cottonwoods produce a very thick bark. The thickness does not come from bark layers, but instead from many, many layers, and we're talking like thousands of layers of phloem. And normally phloem is produced and like I said, it's crushed and it's gone. But in this particular species, for some reason, the phloem remains underneath the bark. And people have discovered that this is quite a nice and easy thing to carve. And so these are referred to as bark carvings. And I say this is more of an Eastern United States phenomenon because most ugly poplars are available there for raw material. And the books I've read about this, they usually collect bark from trees that are dead. They don't take them off live trees. Here we have really only the black cottonwood, which is along riverbeds, which gets large enough to produce bark that would be able to do this kind of sculpting. But the sculpting is fascinating. This is a black cottonwood. You can see how large it is, and you can see how thick the bark is on it. It's quite thick. And also keep in mind, underneath that bark is the phloem that's sort of layered. And we go from there to this. And these are bark carvings. And they're only bark and phloem that they're working with. And sometimes they refer to these as wood spirits, that because they're in the bark there somewhere, all you have to do is find them. And you see these elaborate pictures of faces that come out of the bark, or whole houses with different levels to them and things like that. And so here's the bark. And this material that comes out kind of brownish and like that is really phloem. And it's very, very unusual because only poplars have this ability to hang on to the phloem. But it makes for a beautiful piece. To be correct, we really can't call it wood. And it's even incorrect to call it bark carving because it's bark and phloem carving. But it's just one aspect or one thing that that we can do and we can take a look at. Now, commonly, a lot of our bowl pieces and a lot of live slabs or live edge slabs and stuff, the bark, of course, is still on there. But in this case, we're just talking about bark and phloem. We're not talking about wood at all. And it's just sort of a fascinating thing that I would think would be interesting to pursue. Anybody tried to do anything with just chunks of bark? All right. Then I'm done. There's the bibliography. If you're interested in bark carving, this number 5 is carving tree bark, releasing whimsical houses and wood spirits from found wood. And then all these other ones, for those of you who like to study botany and the terminology that comes with it, Mouseth is a famous professor at University of Texas in Austin. This is his book. Very good book for if you ever want to, like what I did for this presentation is I read everything he had about roots in that book and stuff like that. A lot of good information. And of course, stealing things from Google, a little bit from Wikipedia. I like Matt Ritter, who's a professor at Cal Poly. And he's got several books, but this Guide to the Trees Among Us in California is a very useful one too. All right, if there are any more questions, I will take them, or I can sit back and sort of relax now.
So I noticed that we taped the presentation today, and this is a topic I think would be very useful to go back and revisit from time to time. So David does that and makes that available to us for the club. So if people are interested in knowing more about the wood that they process for their bowls and vessels and didn't see Tony's presentation today, know that it's going to be on our website in the members area in the future, very, very near future, but it'll be there.
Thank you very much, Tony. It was very good and very interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I'm glad I didn't bore everybody to tears.
No.
Quite the opposite, Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Tony.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.